My name is Farida Afari. I am an Iranian-American librarian, translator, and writer based in Los Angeles. I am speaking with Budour Hassan, who is a Palestinian socialist feminist journalist from Nazareth. She studied law at Hebron University and speaks 4 languages. She is currently a legal researcher for the Jerusalem Center for Legal Aid and Human Rights, and she's speaking to us from Jerusalem. Hello, Budour, and thank you so much for giving me and viewers the time for this conversation.
Hi, Frida, and thank you for speaking to me.
So I'll start with the first question. The latest Israeli assaults on Palestinians have been more severe in the scale of bombings and killings of people in Gaza and the ferocity of mobs of state-sponsored Jewish extremist gangs lynching Palestinians, attacking homes in the few ethnically mixed towns and neighborhoods inside Israel. We have also seen the coming together of Palestinians from Gaza, the West Bank, and inside Israel in a general strike to resist Israeli occupation and apartheid. Please tell us more about the new features of the Israeli assault and the new features of the Palestinian resistance.
This, what we can call latest round of our ongoing struggle against Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid, the spark that initially lit everything. It's always, we always want to look to foundations, but I can say that the spark that lit the whole thing was when Israeli forces decided on the first day of Ramadan to close off the plaza of Damascus Gate with barricades and prevent Palestinian youth from gathering, which is a tradition on the nights of Ramadan. Palestinian youth, obviously, this particular space, the Damascus Gate steps, has been facing several attempts by Israel to close it off, to occupy it symbolically by changing or by naming the steps after 2 Israeli soldiers, despite Palestinian rejection, by installing surveillance cameras, by turning it into some sort of a fortified military zone for the soldiers, because they know the importance, the strategic and emotional and social significance of this gate as the central gate to the old city, as the place where Palestinians gather. And because youth responded with so much passion and with so much energy and spirit, Israel responded by attacking them nightly. The youth, their numbers only increased. This led after that, on the second Thursday of Ramadan, a group of settlers led by the settler organization Lahava marched on the streets of Jerusalem, calling for death to Arabs, as they always do. It's obviously very important to see them in the context. These settlers are not only empowered by the state, they are supported by the state. They're not simply a fringe or some sort of extremists who don't represent the state. They have direct support from the Israeli government and from the Israeli parliament, even though they kind of tend to do what the Israeli state cannot do directly because it has other considerations to worry about, like its these diplomatic considerations, while a group like Lahava can just flex its muscles without fearing any repercussions and knowing that the state's always there to support it. Palestinians only escalated their struggle. They forced Israel to withdraw, the Israeli police to withdraw the barricades from Damascus Gate. And the momentum that started from Damascus Gate expanded to an already burgeoning protest movement in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which is threatened with forcible eviction with ethnic cleansing, a neighborhood whose the majority of these residents who are threatened with forcible evictions have already been displaced in 1948 and turned into refugees. So we're talking about refugee families that are facing a second displacement, a second mass displacement. So the movement that started in Damascus Gate joined hands with the movement that was growing in Sheikh Jarrah. And from then also movements from all around Palestine joined in solidarity and and emphasized that the struggle of Sheikh Jarrah is a microcosm of a larger struggle taking place across Palestine. Among the features of this struggle is first the huge women presence, not only as protesters, but also as organizers, as reporters, writers, as volunteer lawyers for the detainees who are brutally detained by Israel, as those who stand on the front line of protest and document it and protect also their comrades, and as those who amplify the voices and the demands of the people of the neighborhood. And also on the technical level or on the organizing level, they organize transport, public transport to the neighborhood, to Jerusalem, to support the people of the neighborhood. They organize activities to keep the momentum going. The movement in Sheikh Jarrah has greatly benefited from the feminist movement Tal'at, which had already been active and whose presence is very clear, it was very vocal and clear, both in Sheikh Jarrah and in the protest on Damascus Gate. So this is one of the main features of the protest. Another feature of the current protest movement is how it erased the boundaries, the colonial boundaries that separate and fragment the Palestinian people on both sides of the Green Line. So basically, it erased the color of this line and joined Palestinians regardless of where they are. And obviously, the support that it has been building from Palestinian refugees in the diaspora, which has been one of the most felt support that we have been receiving from from the refugee population in the diaspora. Obviously, since after Gaza entered into the equation, which when the leader of the military wing of Hamas, of Qassam, Mohammed Deif, threatened that if Israel doesn't withdraw from Sheikh Jarrah, there will be a response. And if the attacks on Al-Aqsa Mosque continue also, there will be a response. Once Gaza entered the equation, the whole face of the movement not only changed, it escalated. Many feared that the fact that we're having a war would diminish the popular struggle taking place within the Green Line or in Jerusalem. But the opposite happened. We realized that we had a responsibility to protect our people on Gaza by going to the streets, by disrupting the normalcy of occupation here, and by saying that we'll continue. We can't enter Gaza to support our people there, but we can continue marching in the streets and basically disrupting the Israeli police, the Israeli army, forcing it to put more manpower, forcing it to have to work on so many different fronts. And this is what we have been saying. The case of the mixed cities, or the case of Palestinians inside 48 or within the Green Line, is obviously the first reason why they rose up was to reinforce their connection with the people in Jerusalem and with the people in Gaza. But they also have other reasons of their own, which are to protest Israel's 73-year occupation, which they refer to it now as occupation, and erasure of their identity, of their presence, their exploitation, their alienation, and all the policies meant or targeting their very presence, how the Israeli police have supported organized crime in Palestine 48 within the Green Line, have the police has been brutally attacking people, how the Israeli state and has used institutionalized racism, discrimination, exploitation against Palestinians within the Green Line. All these long decades of exploitation suddenly erupted and forced and led people into the streets. And this is why it's important not to fall in the trap of treating the protests in mixed cities like Led, Akka, Jaffa, Haifa, not to treat it as intercommunal or a civil war between Palestinians and Jews, but to view it as an uprising by Palestinians against state-sponsored settlers, basically. We're talking about the so-called Torah nucleuses, the Ger'in Torani, which are religious Zionist organizations that have been supported by the states, that have been colonizing and building settler outposts in mixed Palestinian cities with the explicit aim of Judaizing these cities and forcing Palestinians out. This has led to massive gentrification of these mixed cities, of forcing Palestinians into the margins and sometimes forcing Palestinians outside of these mixed cities, of raising the prices of real estate. We're talking about religious Zionist groups that understand the link between real estate and ideology, and they're using the sponsorship that they have from the state to brutalize Palestinians. And this has only added to the poverty, to the state-sponsored poverty imposed on Palestinians, to the internal violence, which is not really internal because it's a violence that sponsored and supported by the state, especially after the uprising of 2000, when the Israeli state, when 13 Palestinians were killed by Israel for rising in solidarity with Al-Aqsa Mosque and with the people in Jerusalem and the West Bank. So the Israeli state saw that the only solution to fragment further Palestinians and prevent them from ever again rising up against state violence and brutality is to alienate these people, is to divide the social fabric of the Palestinian community within the Green Line by supporting organized crime, by pretending to care while it has not only been complicit with organized crime families, but have been actively allowing guns to spread and violence to spread and doing nothing. And actually, for many months, Palestinians in many cities have been protesting the role of that the Israeli police as a racist organization has played in fueling the crime, and have said that the solution to what's going on is not simply inclusion and not simply to have more police units, because police has always aimed to kill us, not to protect us. But the solution is to actually to treat it from its root, to know that Israel as a colonial regime has used so many strategies in order to kill our resistance and to erase our identity. And the only solution to face this is to understand our extension as Palestinian people. And this is what the current uprising has made it possible. And this is what we saw during the general strike that Palestinians declared last Tuesday, when from the river to the sea, Palestinians went on strike, despite Israel's threats to repress them, to fire those who went on strike, especially the more vulnerable and marginalized workers who don't really have networks of support. But we also saw how many volunteer Palestinian lawyers have said that they are going to support any Palestinian worker threatened with expulsion or being fired on account of participating in the strike. So all these modes of solidarity that are challenging colonial borders, that are redefining and reclaiming Palestinian geography as it was, is really one of the most important features of the current uprising.
Thank you, Budour. That was a wonderful, wonderful introduction. And I really appreciate both the further explanation that you gave of the state-sponsored nature of the gang attacks. I would call them pogroms. I would call them pogroms against Palestinians. And I also appreciate your bringing out the role of women, which I haven't seen much discussed in the reports. The very strong participation of women in every aspect of the protest, and of course the both regional and international dimension of the Palestinian struggle. And what when I first learned about you, it was precisely because of your rootedness in that internationalism. And I remember reading a statement that you had written in solidarity with Syrian revolutionaries. And you've also written about the Kurdish struggle in the Middle East. And that takes me to my second question, which is, you are a Palestinian socialist feminist who openly expresses her opposition to all capitalist, imperialist, and religious fundamentalist powers and forces in the region. In your blog, Random Shelling, you say that you despise nationalism and patriotism and stand for universal human emancipation. You have expressed your solidarity with Syrian revolutionaries against the brutal and authoritarian Assad regime, with Kurdish activists for Kurdish self-determination, with Iranian women protesting against the brutal Iranian regime. Why has it been so difficult for us Middle Eastern socialists to promote this type of principled stand and come together around it?
I think one of the reasons is that we tend to think short term. And I think the way this region has been divided in terms of who supports who militarily, especially, has led us to believe that as Palestinian, we should support or stand with any power that claims to oppose the United States. And I stress the word claims, because on many occasions, it doesn't really oppose the United States per se, but use it as a fig leaf to cover its oppression. And even if it's, and sometimes there is obviously the material fact of some of these regimes supporting military and armed resistance in the region. Now we know that they do that for their own private interests. But again, the very fact, especially for many of us, for instance, as Palestinians who had long felt abandoned, then when we feel like there are very few states that support us militarily or rhetorically, then we say, okay, so how can we come against these states? Obviously, it doesn't justify. I'm just trying to think why it has been so difficult to overcome this state-centered approach to what's going on. And I think this is a problem of nationalism in general, of the modern nation state also, that we can't think beyond state and beyond these narrow interests. And I think this has also unfortunately reflected, for instance, very few Palestinians know about the very active role that Kurdish women, both in Kurdistan and in those who are refugees in Europe, have played in support of the Palestinian cause, because the voices that are amplified is that of the few Kurdish political leaders who are sympathetic to Israel or who express that they don't care about the Palestinian cause. Very few Palestinians hear about the Iranians who have always supported the Palestinian struggle, be it and also opposed the Iranian regime, be it in Iran or those Iranians who lived in Europe or who are refugees who have been displaced or forced into political exile in Europe and the United States. So very few of us know about them, but instead we know about the right-wing Iranians who always say, don't care about Palestine. We have our own concerns, and who incite against Palestinians or who express their support for Israel. I think the fact that this selective coverage of which voices get attention, that these right-wingers, instead of those who have always supported us, get attention. And on the other hand, the same happens here. We know much more about those who support the Assad regime, those who support the military governments, the military dictatorships, rather than those who have always been vocal in their opposition against all forms of oppression and all regimes of oppression. I think it's a matter of which voices get amplified. I think it's also a matter of our really terrible political reality, in which you don't really have the luxury of choosing your allies, because it is sometimes forced on you, and you feel like there is very little you can do. And sometimes you feel like as individuals, we only have our voices. We don't have weapons. We are always accused of not thinking strategically, of being too innocent or too naive or something, because and forgetting what's the larger picture. I think I can't deny that it is very complicated. At the same time, look, when I see how in every Palestinian protest there is this reproduction of the same chants that have been chanted during the Syrian uprising, and when I say that words like Azadi have become even beloved words on the streets by some of the people here, when I see how we are, okay, we were probably not as powerful as the side that supported by the states, but I feel like there are possibilities. I think someday, perhaps, when we are freer, at least, we can actually think more about what we can do to help each other, rather than just being entangled in this geopolitical game. I think sometimes, especially in really more difficult times, it's really hard to disentangle yourself, because no matter how much you say that it is about the people, it's not about geopolitics. Geopolitics does affect what's going on, whether we like it or not, and these interests do affect what's going on. It is important, at least from our probably not very influential position, to always emphasize that I personally, I can't claim to speak on anyone else's behalf. I see that the struggle of political prisoners in Iran, in Syria, here in Palestine is one struggle. And I see so many threads in common in how the people rise up and how the people continue fighting every time, despite always being written off. And when I see that I continue to learn, continue to be inspired by the feminist movement by Kurdish women in Syria and Rojava, their struggle for self-determination, for democracy, that has taught us so many things, I think. So all these things, and also obviously Kurdish women in Turkey, Kurdish prisoners, political prisoners in Turkey. Again, we also have the claim of Erdogan to support the Palestinian cause, but obviously we know how cozy he is when it comes to maintaining economic relations with Israel. So again, it is always deflating to see other people buy into these propaganda. I think it's very important to work on this. I do understand that it takes time. I hope that this next generation that is not as bound or is not the political representative of anyone is more conscious of the fact that ultimately in this region, the only liberation is one that begins by us, that you will never be liberated by a state that oppresses, that exploits, that kills its citizens or non-citizens, or state that is based on tyranny and on injustices, including social injustices. And I hope that this will accumulate to create this conviction in the near future, and this will only lead to more truer solidarity and coordination between us as exploited, marginalized, and colonized peoples in this region.
I hope so too. And I definitely agree with you that when a people are under so much pressure, under occupation, and being shot at and killed, and suffering from pogroms and daily assaults, that it is very hard to disentangle yourself from the geopolitical game. It is hard to see the bigger picture. At the same time, your beautiful presentation just shows that there are many Palestinians who are seeing the bigger picture and do not want to get disentangled in the geopolitical game. And at the same time, I think your response just suggested that the focus on women's struggles and political prisoners are two areas in which we can really allow for that kind of regional and international solidarity. So that's what I'm going to turn to now. The next question is about the feminist struggle.
Yeah.
It is the following. In September of 2019, hundreds of Palestinian women took to the streets in Haifa, Jerusalem, Ramallah, and Gaza to protest against femicide. They chanted, "Free homeland, free women," and said they do not separate the struggle against Israeli occupation from the struggle against misogyny and femicide. They demanded action against gendered violence and called for the recognition of women's right to autonomy. How has this Palestinian Me Too movement fared? What is the state of solidarity between Jewish and Palestinian women, given that militarism and misogyny is pervasive in Israel?
Okay, so I will divide my questions into two sections. The first pertaining to the movement itself. Since September 2019, the movement continues to expand, not only through the organization of protests, but also through its support for outlets that highlighted women's experiences with sexual violence, especially at the hands of prominent Palestinian leaders, intellectuals, human rights, in human rights organizations as well, in the spaces where you would expect that there is more respect for women's rights, but apparently it's not the case. And it just goes to show how misogyny is everywhere, really, not just including in human rights or within a human rights organization and in the academia as well. And the role of this movement and how this movement has also joined other social movements growing inside Palestine, like the movement against, like the movement which started in the Palestinian city of al-Fahm within the Green Line against the Israeli police and its role in supporting and empowering organized crime. So Tal'at and the movement of al-Fahm and other student movements participated in the organization of these protests. They also joined hands in hands with LGBTQ movements against violence and incitement against LGBTQ and queer activists and queer people in Palestine, whilst at the same time condemning and clearly taking a stance against Israeli pinkwashing and the machine basically of Israeli pinkwashing. So there have been small steps, but there has been much work behind the scenes, not only on the street in organizing. And the importance of the work that Tal'at has done since 2019 has been reflected in what we're saying now, because activists in Tal'at as a movement and as a part of an umbrella of social movements has participated in the organizing for the general strike and what to do during the general strike in order to turn it not just into a day of off, but a day of action, a day of protest, a day of crystallizing consciousness. For example, also of organizing organizing for protest by helping women. For example, we had a funeral in al-Fahm for a Palestinian martyr who was killed by Israeli police last Thursday. So you saw the activists in Tal'at using their network and using their groups in order to organize public transport cars, because Israel, if we had tried to reach al-Fahm through buses and public transport, Israel would not allow us to enter, as it has typically tended to do during moments of escalation. So you had see every woman organized through our groups to make sure that all of us reach there and are safe. Also, there have been this mutual movement of support of those women who we can share our experiences during the protests, what we go through, if there are also misogynistic remarks that we face from within the protests, or if there is obviously the biggest threat that we as Palestinian women face when we are at protest is Israeli soldiers and police men and women's attacks on our bodies, on the sovereignty and autonomy of our bodies. This is the main attack, but obviously highlighting all this and make sure that women are always there in the public space, even when our presence annoys some conservative figures within these public spaces. So this was very important. So it's clear that this accumulation, the presence of Tal'at, and when the Tal'at were organizing these small protests in support of women prisoners and against femicide, against misogyny, there was very little happening on the street, politically speaking. So it was one of the very few movements organizing protests in the streets, especially in Jerusalem. And we were getting repressed and we were getting beaten, including when we organized a protest in support of Iyad, a Palestinian who was killed by Israeli police and who has autism and who was killed by Israeli police in Jerusalem. So we were brutally killed when we participated in a protest against this killing. We were brutally beaten by the police. So this was one of example of what things that we did that intersected also with with the activism of Tal'at as Palestinians. Obviously, its activism differs from one city to the other, depending on the strength, the numbers of the activists in that in that city, but it has always remained active, and it has, as I said, provided a very important infrastructure for us to use during these emergency moments as a organizing force, which is, I think, very important. And we see particularly the importance of this on how you see, especially the vast majority of lawyers who are now representing detainees. And it's very important because Israel has been going on a rampage of mass detentions and arrests against Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line. And you see how the vast majority of the lawyers representing these detainees pro bono are female lawyers. Who stay all night really without running on very, very little sleep to support the detainees and really stretching themselves to the very limits. So all these are examples of the role that Palestinian feminists, whether within the under the auspices of Tal'at, or as feminists, or as women, have contributed to this current explosion and to this current movement. Now, on the other side, regarding your question, unfortunately, or perhaps it's not surprising, obviously, Israeli women, Zionist women, have played a central role in enforcing and supporting Israeli militarism. We see this in those police officers who beat us in the streets, many of whom are women, the Israeli border police women. We see it in those who serve in the army and pride themselves in serving in the army, and who are, we see these in the Israeli ministers, female ministers and Knesset members who incite against us, threatened in 2014 with raping Palestinian women, and who have waged a war on Palestinian women. We see this on the racism of Israeli women and including Israeli feminists, including Israeli liberal feminists, against us. The most liberal, one of the most staunch Israeli feminists, Zionist feminists right now in the Israeli Knesset, Merav Michaeli, who was the leader of the Israeli Labor Party, actually, when she was asked about what the Israeli army is doing in Gaza, she said that she has full trust in the Israeli army. It's the only professional, its morality is never in doubt. It's the only professional organization. So when you see these remarks, obviously the vast majority of them have served in the army, in the Israeli army, are very militaristic. While they don't probably directly participate in mob attacks against Palestinians, or while some of them even oppose, but they are very active in the incitement. And this is why it's very important not to fall for this claim, oh, the only ones who are attacking are men. Perhaps the only one who are carrying out the attacks are men, but Israeli women are playing a leading role in inciting them and in participating them. So it's kind of, it's very important not to fall for this. And I think this is why I always have believed that it's impossible for Palestinian women, Palestinian feminists, to have any sort of alliance with Israeli Zionist feminists, because our objectives are so entirely opposite to one another. Because for them, the militaristic nature of the Israeli state, the foundational myth of the Israeli state, is never put in doubt. And because for them, their whole feminism stops the moment we try to talk about Palestinian right to return to dignity, to liberation, to freedom, even though sometimes they might fake caring about our rights. But it's not as feminists, as Palestinian feminists, we can't separate our emancipation as women from our emancipation as Palestinian. This is why the only way the only way to support us, or the only alliance, or the only ones we can find any common ground with are those who express their explicit opposition to Zionism, to Israeli militarism, and who actually say and acknowledge that you can't separate the fight for feminist liberation from the fight against Israeli settler colonialism.
And what about the non-Zionist feminists inside Israel? What about those connections? Surely not all the feminists inside Israel support Zionism.
Not all, but the anti-Zionists in Israel are a very, very small minority, I have to confess to you. Obviously, some of them participate in boycott movements. Some of them even join some of our protests and participate in protests, and have actually been attacked and beaten by Israeli police. And I think, yeah, although they are a tiny, 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 tiny minority, but yeah, they definitely exist. And they had fought. Some of them actually had left Palestine because they found out that it's impossible to actually stay here and preserve your, staying within this system that privileges one people just on the virtue of their religion or ethnicity. They just couldn't reconcile with this. But of course, for me, the litmus test is those who say they support the right of return, they oppose Zionism, and they respect Palestinians' choices of how to lead our cause. For me, they are welcome in the Palestinian struggle against colonization, and they know that they are welcome. Actually, again, as I say that, I acknowledge that they are a very small minority, but I also acknowledge that they exist. And some of them don't even self-define as Israeli, and have used their privilege in order to support the Palestinian cause, especially to work in movements for boycott from within. And we value that as Palestinians. So yes, I can't say that there is a strategic work to create alliances with them. I say that our alliance is predominantly among Palestinian women, just because of the nature of the struggle here. But as I say that, I'm also think that they despite their small numbers, they have always supported us, and we value the support. And above all, also, we value those who acknowledge and realize that this struggle must be led by Palestinians, and they must listen to the voices of Palestinians and not use their privilege as something that gives them the right to tell us or to preach to us what they do. So for those who acknowledge us, and also know that there definitely have been there have been important allies for the Palestinian cause, whether they are here or those anti-Zionists who are not in Palestine.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. And it is so wonderful to hear about the Talat movement, and how the Talat movement, as I understand, is really the Palestinian Me Too movement. That's
not exactly. I have to say.
Okay, then tell me more.
I'm kind of a bit. I have some problems with this, because Talat, I'd rather view it as the daughter of previous feminist struggle that emerged in Palestine. We use these discourses, we build on the legacies of our ancestors, rather than legacies of, and obviously there is the problem of the over whiteness of Me Too as a movement, which we will probably will not enter in this debate. But of course, some of the things that emerged after Talat became a movement is that, yes, I mean, Palestinian women who wanted to speak out against, and many can't speak out, but those who could speak out and who received the protection and the support to speak out. And yes, every place in the world has its own Me Too movement. It can be framed or articulated differently, and I think it must be like that. But of course, it's something you can't deny the global influence that Me Too as a movement had gone. I just rather see this movement as the something out of our own context, especially that it doesn't simply highlight the voices of those only the well-off or those who have, and it acknowledges that many women probably can't speak out, and just doesn't only, also it has many different faces and many different ways of organizing that's not limited to highlighting cases of sexual harassment or of femicide. I probably see it more connected, for example, to the movement of Ni Una Menos, the Argentine feminist movement, or also the Mexican feminist movement, or the feminist movement in Chile, to be honest, rather than connected with Me Too, if I'm being honest with you.
Oh no, that's wonderful. Actually, that's that similarity with the Ni Una Menos movement in Argentina and the Mexican women's movement against gender violence and women's strike, the whole women's strike movement. That's wonderful connection. And I also honestly did, when I said Me Too, I didn't mean it as a Western centered movement. And I mean, considering that Me Too in the US, it was founded by Tarana Burke, who's an African-American woman. And so it was rooted in the struggles of African-American women and certainly not rich women or well-off women. But yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's a much broader struggle, and it has a history, and it's native, and all of those dimensions have to be acknowledged, and I appreciate that. And I think the viewers are going to really appreciate learning that too. Which takes me to my next question, which is about women political prisoners, or women prisoners in general. In October of 2020, Palestinian feminist activist and political prisoner Khaled Jarrar smuggled a very moving open letter from the Israeli Damon prison. In this letter addressed to the Palestinian Writers Literature Festival, she wrote about the importance of books as, quote, the foundation of life inside prison, unquote, where the Israeli jailers, quote, seek to strip us from our humanity, unquote. She wrote about how Israeli jails confiscate books sent to prisoners and deprive Palestinians of access to books as a means of punishing them. For instance, she and other Palestinian prisoners are not allowed to get Gramsci's prison notebooks and many other educational books. She also wrote about how, despite this deprivation and the solitary confinement and surveillance and lack of family visits, Palestinian prisoners still manage to write novels inside prison or conduct studies. For instance, she conducted a study about violations against Palestinian women and child prisoners, and also wrote a paper about education inside Israeli prisons. So this is all from the letter that Khaled Jarrar smuggled out of prison. There are certainly commonalities between the plight of Palestinian women prisoners and women prisoners in other parts of the Middle East, such as Iran, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. And yet, there have been few attempts to organize joint support for women prisoners in the region, or draw global connections between the plight of women prisoners in the Middle East, US, China, Myanmar, Africa, Russia, Latin America, and elsewhere. Why do you think so little has been done by socialist feminists in creating regional and global connections concerning the issues of women prisoners? And what do you think we can learn from abolitionist feminism in the US, again, started by African-American women? What do you think we can learn from abolitionist feminism in the US in moving in that direction?
I thank you for sharing and quoting from Khalida's letter. Khalida has been in and out of Israeli prisons basically for the entirety of her life. And her presence in prisons also has supported so many younger female prisoners, especially those who are not well known or not supported by their families, and who come from poor and working class communities, and don't get to have the media attention. Khalida has always used whatever attention she has received in order to highlight their case, and there is no prisoner, female prisoner in particular, who come out of prison who doesn't mention the role Khalida. Even those with whom she doesn't agree ideologically, she has always supported every woman prisoner. Khalida is a socialist, but she also has always supported women regardless of their women prisoners, regardless of their political affiliation, and they've always respected her. I think your question, again, the same answer applies. The problem is, the problem is we don't, instead of viewing our struggle against the prison industrial complex worldwide, we view it against certain regimes. And again, this idea that there are some good jailers and bad jailers, and we will support the women who are imprisoned by the so-called bad jailers. But if they are imprisoned by good jailers, even if they are leftists, and obviously our support shouldn't only be limited to women leftists, and again, shouldn't only be limited to political prisoners. Because when we say abolition, we say abolition of the entirety of the prison industrial complex, whether the background of the detention, the arrest is criminal or political. But this is also another problem, is that we always privilege the issue of political prisoner and tend to overlook non-political prisoners, be it women or men, which is also another big question, and another part where we can learn a lot from the Black abolitionist movement in the United States, which has never limited itself to political prisoners, and which has always rejected respectability politics that tend to privilege one group of prisoners over the others, and has called for explicit abolition of all prisons and of the entirety of this system that is based on the punitive system, basically, that has proven time and time again its futility in actual, and that it not only does it not end crime, it actually reinforces crime and reinforces discrimination and reinforces forced labor and etc. So I think we read some of these literature, we don't really work in accordance with it, and that's one problem of how you turn the literature into something, from something you just read in papers into something that moves your work. I think it's also our responsibility as feminists not to shake hands with the punitive system and to understand that sometimes I know also again that this is again a very long discussion about feminism, but I do think that there is this carcerary, we call it, or the carceral feminism that pretends that the solution, for example, to gender violence, sexual violence is always to imprison those who commit these crimes, without actually, when there are other models that should and must be approached. And while I do understand this, the fear that they want to preserve to have accountability, because there is no accountability. We also know that police, regardless of where it is, has never really supported feminism, women's calls for ending violence, but has been reinforced, the biggest force that has supported violence against women. So I think this is one reason why it has been so difficult to find solidarity, is that we as feminists in our own can't erase this, or can't really think beyond political and non-political prisoner. Second, as I said, because of the commitment to distinguish between good jailers and bad jailers and decide whom we are going to support based on the identity of the jailer, rather than the fact that we should reject the prison industrial complex everywhere. And thirdly, I think it extends, I mean, any movement, the abolitionist movement, or the movement in support or in solidarity with political prisoner, is an extension of all sorts of other movements. So when you have the same problem within the movement at large of breaking these political affiliation and breaking these boundaries, so it's not surprising that when it comes to prison, we are seeing the same problem. I've always been, as you said at the start, if there is one issue that should unify us, it's the issue of prisoners, because imprisonment is an immoral and inhuman way of responding to anything, really. It's one of the most repressive, suffocating ways to treat to treat human beings. And add to it what happens in prisons, from torture, from denial of basic rights, from surveillance, from really the gaps that go, the destruction of the spirit that these prisons enact, both on the spirit and on the body of the prisoners. So I think if there is anything that we should do, is to use this rejection of this form of punishment and discipline in order to unify us. I do hope really that one day we can break free from these ideological cages, really, because I do consider them to be cages, and actually think more internationally and more universally of how to support, how to have this overall in this universal movement for abolition, based obviously on the hugely important work initiated by Black American abolitionists, and which has reached out and which has inspired us to turn this literary and to turn this inspiration from something that we read into something that we implement in our praxis.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I totally agree with you. I mean, this whole conversation has been so illuminating, and I really agree with you that the main barrier is that we cannot break through the prison mentality and the prison model, and of course what you said earlier about being caught up in the geopolitical games and not having a global view. Both, I think, go hand in hand. But I agree that with abolitionist feminism, there's so much that we can build on, and hopefully people who listen to this conversation will reach out And so we can really move forward on the idea of global solidarity on the issue of support for not only women political prisoners, but women prisoners in general, and all prisoners. And you know, I called the women or prisoners who are not political prisoners, I call them social prisoners, because they're still damaged by society, and it's the fault of society and our lack of care and lack of attention and all the harm done to people that makes them end up in prison.
Yeah, they are scarred by institutions of exploitation and oppression, and their imprisonment only make these scars bigger and bigger and these bruises bigger and bigger, so that even if they get out of prison, the damage not only grows, they are unable to actually, especially here, you know, Frida, the stigma that is attached to women who are imprisoned, regardless of the reason.
Yeah.
The stigma is a huge thing. It actually makes it very difficult for women to actually go back to life. Yeah. Obviously, there's a stigma in any kind of imprisonment, but for women in particular, it's a big factor. Not to mention the women prisoners who are mothers, who are single mothers, who are. I mean, there are so many sisters, and and the vast majority of them are poor and working class, and who are even, unfortunately, who are even forsaken by mainstream feminism. Yeah. And that's very sad and very depressing. It's just that some movements feel like there are people who are not quote unquote cool to support. Yeah. They add. They kind of make our struggle look ugly, you know. Yeah. So they are forsaken not just by these systems of domination, they are forsaken even by us who are supposed to stand with them and to understand. We help re-stigmatize them with our insistence on categorizing and on creating. I know, of course, you should mention the motive and why and why and how. And I'm not saying that we should not speak of a category of political prisoners. You said social prisoners. Yes, they are social prisoners, but in a sense, they are also political prisoners, because these systems of oppression that create a prison population, these are also political factors. These are political, social, economic factors, that because politics is everywhere, permeates everything. And it's our failure to actually respect the humanity and the beauty of these people and of these prisoners is something that has let us down, and something, and it's one of the really, I think, down of the many problems of bourgeois feminism in general, I should say.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And hopefully this conversation will lead to others reaching out and moving forward on this issue, because it's just a burning issue and we can't leave it at this. We really need to act on this issue. And that brings me to my last question. I mean, I could ask many more questions, but I know your time is limited. So my last question is, how can socialist feminists in the Middle East region and around the world help the Palestinian struggle? Specifically speaking as an Iranian socialist feminist, I would like to know how Palestinian and Iranian socialist feminists can create strong bonds of solidarity that also expose the Iranian regime, Hamas, and any entity that claims to support Palestinian self-determination but promotes capitalist authoritarianism and misogyny.
Okay, so I think, first of all, I think that it's Yeah, it's a very complicated question, I have to say, that really requires a nuanced thinking. I think especially for us Palestinians, there is always also this separation between, yes, Hamas as a political party is authoritarian and we have so many problems with that. On the other hand, the armed wing of Hamas is also our only strong way, a form of armed resistance that we have. So, you know, it's very complicated that we know, but we know that once this war will settle down, as the blockade continues, we know how Hamas as a governing, ruling authority, de facto authority in Gaza will continue not just to deny basic rights for everyone really, but especially for women as a fundamentalist group. So this is one of the things that we should also keep in mind. So this is, this is one of the contradictions that we have. We have no option but to face really. You'd see feminists supporting and celebrating what we consider to be the victory of the people of Gaza, and actually the victory of the Palestinian resistance against Israel. But on the other hand, also acknowledging that this victory, this resistance will be exploited and manipulated by Hamas in order to entrench its authoritarianism in Gaza. And it's not just Hamas, by the way. I mean, the Palestinian Authority is also very patriarchal and misogynistic. And despite trying to look otherwise, I think that the dialogue, knowing each other, speaking of how Iranian, Palestinian, Syrian, Egyptian, Saudi, Yemeni, Kurdish, etc., Turkish feminists can do, is knowing each other, recognizing our joint struggle, trying to network, I think, especially when the situation is much calmer, and rethinking the boundaries that have always been used to separate us as leftist feminists who are also opposed to authoritarianism, militarism, Zionism, and fundamentalism, regardless of what religion it or what sect it represents. So I think this is very important. I think what others can do to us, I mean, those, especially those who can, those who are, and I know they already do, be it Iranian, Kurdish, Syrian feminists who are in Europe, in the United States. I know that they do take to the streets in Palestinian, in pro-Palestine protests. They are also active in BDS movements. They write, they talk about Palestine. I know how influential they are in the Palestinian movement, and it's really, and I hope that many Palestinians also know that, and not just see, you know, whenever an Iranian, for example, an Iranian singer, artist who's affiliated with the opposition, an Iranian figure who is affiliated with the opposition, comes and expresses his support for Israel, we see a storm and so much attention, but we don't get a fraction of this attention to the numerous Iranian who are also opposed to the, as I said earlier, who are also opposed to the Iranian regime and who are also opposed to Zionism. This is not amplified, this is not highlighted. So I think your solidarity and your messages of solidarity are really very meaningful and give me in particular a lot of strength, especially in these times of fear, of grief, of heartbreak, but of also hope. Hope as a foundation for a political project, because I think we can't continue without it. It's the most rational thing to do right now, is to cling to this hope and to work moved by this and fueled by this hope to enact it and to use it as the foundation of our political project for liberation. I think I do see that the future, as I said, that with new generations coming up and understanding and making this distinction, it's going to change. I hope that this is going to change. I know, as I said, it will take a long time, but I'm very, look, I have this faith that this situation is unsustainable, that people will no longer, there are so many myths that we have been indoctrinated on, that we will no longer accept them as conventions or as something, as obvious facts, and we will challenge them just as we are challenging Israeli foundational myths and Israeli fragmentation methods. So I hope that this inspires us to challenge other form of fragmentation, especially fragmentation among the feminists, leftist feminists in this region, to challenge all forms of oppression. I know it's, as I said, it will take a long time, and we're gonna face a lot of letdowns and feelings of there is nothing happening or very slow progress is happening. But I think this is the nature of any form of political work. It takes time, but hopefully there will be some sort of accumulation that will build and build on our efforts and our work. And hopefully what we're saying in this interview will be the start of something concrete.
I agree, and I really appreciate your comments. I certainly agree that there are many Iranians who oppose Zionism, but also oppose the Iranian regime and the way it's using the Palestinian struggle to promote its own authoritarianism, giving lip service to the Palestinian struggle, but not really caring about Palestinians as human beings. I also think that that there are definitely a lot of women in the Middle East region and globally, socialist feminists who would like to network. And you're right that this is a time of fear, but also time of hope and possibilities. And the current situation is unsustainable. And I look forward to coming back to you and continuing this conversation. And is there anything else that you want to say before we end the conversation?
No, I just want to thank you for this conversation. Really, it was a food for thought, of also making me think about, we didn't prepare for this, so it's kind of, you probably caught me unprepared. And especially sometimes in these days, I have to admit that as much as we like to analyze, when you are on the street, it's a bit difficult to be 100% rational, especially in such a historic moment like the one we're going through, and especially with all the adrenaline streaming in, and it's and I have not had such a long conversation for a long time, especially before what happened. It was a very difficult couple of years, especially a very difficult year. So there was somewhat a revival of spirit, revival of possibility that this uprising has brought with it. So I just thank you for allowing me to think out loud and for us challenging me with these questions and with really stimulating me to think. And hopefully we will have other conversations, and we will keep thinking together and keep working together for a better future for all of us.
Thank you. And I just want to say, Budour, that even when you say you're caught unprepared, you're so thoughtful and so articulate that if that's what being caught unprepared means, then I don't know what you can do when you're prepared, because this was tremendous. And I learned a lot from our conversation. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording now.